when the sleek, overpriced video feed suddenly illuminated my monitor during a routine inventory ledger update. I had no idea my world was about to be flipped upside down. A 20-something hotshot named Julian, boasting a blinding white smile, a gelled fade, and a tailored suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage, was enthusiastically introduced by management as our new corporate restructuring specialist. He flashed a predatory grin at the camera while spouting hollow corporate jargon about cutting dead weight, and his eyes locked onto mine as if he were sizing up an ancient piece of office furniture that needed to be hauled to the dump. Without missing a beat or showing a hint of anxiety, I quietly dragged my master database containing every state environmental permit, hazardous waste clearance, and regulatory authorization into an encrypted folder labeled Grandma's Cookie Recipes, instantly backing it up to an offline hard drive. By noon, I overheard Julian in the break room joking with a pair of eager young analysts about purging the company's ancient, outdated personnel. At 44, I was hardly ancient, but in Julian's mind, anyone who did not rely on automated apps to run a complex logistics network was a dinosaur destined for extinction. Later that afternoon, Julian gathered the entire department into the central atrium for an impromptu stand-up meeting that felt more like a circus than a professional briefing. He grandly presented a chaotic slide deck loaded with absurd buzzwords like dynamic workflow synergy and agile compliance ecosystems, while the fresh-faced interns nodded along in breathless adoration. Standing right beside my desk, Julian pointedly remarked that long-serving team members with legacy duties would be rigorously evaluated to see if they fit into his lean, modern vision for the company's future. He condescendingly thanked me for my historical contributions, as though I were a dusty artifact in a museum rather than the sole individual keeping the entire facility legally operational. I simply smiled back at him with absolute calm, knowing full well he was striding directly into a massive regulatory minefield I had meticulously maintained for over a decade. That very evening, I stayed behind in the quiet, dim office to meticulously cross-reference every single one of my personal credentials across 4 separate government portals. I carefully printed out my original employment contract, paying special attention to Section 1 to B, which explicitly stated that all company-funded environmental certifications tied to my personal social security number would immediately terminate upon my involuntary release. By the following Tuesday, Julian had triumphantly taped a ridiculous motivational banner above the water cooler that proclaimed speed trumps process in bright pink font. He then announced that every single employee would have to formally re-interview for their own positions in a performative display meant to prove their worth to his new regime. When my turn arrived, I casually walked into the glass-walled conference room without a polished resume, sitting across from a man who barely bothered to look up from his phone screen. He casually mentioned that my role as senior regulatory custodian was being phased out and handed off to a junior marketing assistant who genuinely thought EPA stood for Everyday Paper Administration. I politely asked if my administrative access to the central compliance vault would remain active during the transition, but Julian dismissively waved his hand and claimed the credentials had already been migrated to a new hire, who barely knew how to save a PDF file. The minute I stepped back out to the hallway, I quietly accessed a hidden, secondary administrative panel I had built years ago, and revoked all external access permissions to the vault entirely. Passing his office later that afternoon, I saw him laughing on a phone call about sweeping away the old dust, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just severed the company's only legal lifeline. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the building had grown increasingly toxic as the newly hired analysts openly mocked my manual tracking methods near the coffee station. They snickered about my color-coded filing system and scoffed at my strict physical audit logs, foolishly believing that a flashy, unvetted software script could magically replace federal compliance standards. When I attempted to log into the main operations system later that afternoon, my screen flashed a harsh red access denied error, signaling that Julian had officially locked me out of the very architecture I had personally programmed. Calls to the Human Resources Department went straight to an automated machine, which cold-heartedly informed me that all inquiries now had to go through Julian's personal desk. He had spent the entire week strategically dropping subtle hints in leadership memos about redundant staff oversight, entirely ignorant of the fact that my biometric signature was the sole authorization key recognized by state inspectors. Knowing my time was short, I took a brief lunch break to visit a local notary public down the street, officially formalizing a legal document for the voluntary surrender of my state-issued regulatory oversight badges. As I strolled back into the building sipping a warm tea, Julian walked past me with a smug smirk, totally unaware that every step he took was pulling his grand restructuring plan closer to an irreversible catastrophe. The final blow landed hard on a dreary Monday morning during Julian's mandatory company-wide alignment seminar. He stood before the anxious crowd in his tight designer blazer, pacing back and forth while delivering a dramatic speech about shedding unproductive baggage for the sake of corporate growth. With zero advance notice, one-on-one consultation, or professional courtesy, he publicly announced to the entire floor that my position had been officially eliminated effective immediately. Two nervous HR representatives quickly handed me a sleek black folder containing my exit paperwork, which explicitly offered no severance package whatsoever in exchange for a swift departure. I pulled out my own silver fountain pen, signed the document with a firm hand, and coolly demanded a printed, stamped copy from my personal records before walking out the front doors with my head held high. The exact moment that contract termination was processed, Section 1 to be triggered an automatic, irrevocable chain reaction across state environmental databases. Within minutes, my personal regulatory credentials were systematically set to nullified status, completely locking the corporation out of every active municipal operating permit they held. Back at my kitchen table, I quietly poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee and turned on a cozy morning television show, watching the digital clock count down until the impending operational collapse. By Wednesday morning, the first massive shockwaves began tearing through the company's regional distribution network. A major pharmaceutical client attempted to clear a multi-million-dollar shipment through our state facility, only to have the regional authority instantly reject the transfer due to an invalid license holder flag. Within 2 short hours, operational dashboards across the entire enterprise were flashing violent red warning icons as automated systems detected the total absence of a certified safety supervisor. Julian frantically marched into the central command pod with his morning espresso, arrogantly asserting that they could simply type a new name into the primary contact field on the website. A pale, terrified junior analyst had to break the news that state law required a fully certified officer to authorize any changes, and re-registering a new candidate would take at least 6 grueling weeks of federal background checks. Desperate to bypass the block, Julian tried to brute force his way into the system using my old credentials, which immediately triggered an automated security lockdown that blacklisted the entire company IP range. As panic ripped through the executive floor, management frantically began searching for ways to contact me, completely unaware that my contractually enforced non-disparagement agreement strictly forbade me from offering uncompensated technical advice. Friday arrived with absolute chaos when 2 state environmental auditors conducted an unannounced, mandatory inspection at the main processing hub. Upon entering the facility, the officers immediately requested to speak with the registered license holder on file to verify chemical storage safety protocols. A frantic Julian sprinted across the building to legal counsel, desperately seeking a way to temporarily bypass the requirement, while the junior staff frantically searched online forums for compliance advice. When Julian tried calling the state board directly to demand an emergency waiver, a COM representative informed him that my credentials had been permanently surrendered and could not be restored without a full audit. Realizing the immense gravity of the situation, the legal team scrambled through my original employment records, only to discover the binding clause they had mindlessly signed off on years prior, right on cue. My personal phone rang with a call from a well-meaning former coworker, who frantically asked if I knew what was happening to the office network. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, looked out at the rainy morning sky, and gently replied that choices always carry consequences before quietly ending the call. Without a certified officer present on site, the state auditors had no choice but to immediately issue a mandatory cease and desist order, freezing every active assembly line in the building. Bright and early on Monday morning, the corporate CEO, Victor Vance, made an emergency landing in his private jet after receiving dozens of frantic calls from enraged shareholders. Dressed in a pristine silk suit and fresh off an overseas vacation, he stormed into the silent facility expecting a minor administrative hiccup, only to find the entire operation completely paralyzed. He pulled up the legal compliance portal on the boardroom projector, staring in absolute disbelief at the glaring red notice confirming that all operating permits had been revoked. Turning his furious gaze toward Julian, who was now trembling in his wrinkled blazer, the CEO demanded to know who had authorized the removal of the company's only certified regulatory officer. Julian tried to stammer out excuses about dynamic efficiency and modernizing the workflow, But Victor slammed his hand onto the mahogany table and demanded my immediate reinstatement at any cost. A high-ranking executive was immediately dispatched to my home with a blank check and a groveling apology, desperate to convince me to salvage their sinking ship before the state levied millions in daily non-compliance fines. I listened politely from my front porch as they offered to double my former salary, but I calmly informed them that my newly launched independent consulting firm charged triple that rate, paid entirely upfront with a guaranteed 5-year contract,